The forest was quiet, unnaturally so. Even the chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves seemed to have vanished, leaving only an oppressive silence that hung heavily in the air. The setting sun cast long shadows across the uneven forest floor, where 6 campers trudged through the undergrowth, laughing nervously as they made their way to their chosen campsite. Emily glanced over her shoulder for the 3rd time in as many minutes. "Did anyone else hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her boyfriend, Jake, grinned and shook his head. "You're just letting the woods spook you. Relax. We're miles from anyone." "Exactly," Emily muttered. "Miles from anyone who can help us." The group had set out earlier that day with high spirits, eager for a weekend escape. Emily and Jake were joined by their friends, Megan, her older brother Daniel, and the inseparable duo, Chris and Eric. The forest, known locally as Black Hollow Woods, was reputed to be vast and untouched, a perfect spot for camping. "Think about it," Chris had said back in the parking lot as they unloaded their gear. "No cell service, no traffic, no work. Just pure nature." Eric had clapped him on the shoulder. "Yeah, and no bathrooms. Real adventurous, Chris." As the trees thickened, swallowing the last hints of sunlight, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. She clutched her flashlight tighter, even though it wasn't dark enough to use it yet. They finally arrived at a clearing, wide and spacious with just enough room for their tents. The remnants of an old fire pit sat in the center, surrounded by scattered stones and weathered wood. "This is perfect," Jake said, dropping his backpack. "Let's set up before it gets dark." As the group pitched their tents and built a fire, the silence became harder to ignore. The forest felt alive, not with the vibrant sounds of nature but with something heavier, like a presence pressing in from all sides. Megan knelt to collect kindling. "Does it seem weird to anyone else that there's no wildlife? No birds, no squirrels, nothing?" Daniel shrugged. "Maybe it's just the season. Things get quieter in late autumn." Chris, who had wandered to the edge of the clearing, called back. "Or maybe it's because we're not alone." The group groaned at his attempt at humor, but Emily shivered. She looked toward the treeline where Chris stood. The shadows there seemed darker than they should have been, as though they were absorbing the last traces of light. "Chris," she said, "don't wander too far." He waved her off. "Relax, Mom. I'll be fine." The fire crackled to life as night fell, casting flickering light over the campers. They laughed and told stories, their voices loud in the otherwise silent woods. Jake handed Emily a marshmallow on a stick, and for a moment her unease faded. "All right," Eric said, leaning forward with a mischievous grin. "Who's got a scary story?" "I've got one," Megan said. "Ever hear about the Black Hollow Witch?" The group leaned in, their interest piqued. Megan smirked, enjoying the attention. "They say a woman lived in these woods 100 years ago. She was accused of witchcraft and burned at the stake. But before she died, she cursed the land. Anyone who enters the forest is being watched. By her." "Watched, huh?" Chris said, glancing over his shoulder. "Well, if she's out there, I hope she likes the show." Emily tossed her marshmallow at him, and the group erupted in laughter. But as the noise died down, a sound emerged from the woods. A faint, deliberate rustling. Everyone froze. "What was that?" Megan whispered. Jake stood, grabbing the flashlight. "Probably a raccoon." "That didn't sound like an animal," Emily said. Her voice was steady, but her hands gripped the edge of her seat. The rustling came again, closer this time. It wasn't the random scurrying of a small creature. It was heavy, measured, like footsteps. Jake shone the flashlight toward the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Hello," he called, his voice firm but uncertain. There was no response. "Maybe it's another camper," Daniel offered. But Emily shook her head. "We haven't seen anyone else all day." The group exchanged nervous glances. Then Chris stood, grinning. "I'll go check it out." "Chris, don't," Emily said, standing as well. But he was already moving toward the treeline, his phone flashlight casting weak beams ahead of him. As Chris disappeared into the woods, the others waited in tense silence. The fire popped and crackled, the only sound besides their breathing. Minutes passed, and Chris didn't return. "Chris!" Jake shouted. Still nothing. Emily stood, her heart pounding. Something's wrong. Suddenly, a scream tore through the night. A short, sharp cry that ended abruptly. Everyone jumped to their feet. "Chris!" Eric shouted, grabbing a stick from the fire as an improvised weapon. But before they could move, Chris stumbled back into the clearing. His face was pale, his breathing ragged. "Chris, what happened?" Daniel asked, running to him. Chris shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "There's something out there," he gasped. "What did you see?" Emily asked. Chris looked at her, his voice trembling. "Eyes. Watching me. Everywhere." Before anyone could respond, the fire suddenly extinguished, plunging the clearing into darkness. A low, guttural growl echoed from the trees, followed by the unmistakable sound of branches snapping. Getting closer. Emily's flashlight flickered to life as she pointed it toward the woods. The beam landed on a figure just beyond the treeline, its shape too tall and too thin to be human. Its glowing eyes locked onto hers. "Run," Chris whispered. And then the thing stepped forward. The moment the creature stepped forward, the air turned cold, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, the sound of her own pulse deafening in her ears. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything she'd ever seen before. The figure stood tall, too tall, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, with patches of mottled blackness, as though the shadows had taken physical form on its body. "Run!" Chris's voice barely broke the tension before he took off toward the tents. The rest of the group followed suit, their feet crunching on the dry underbrush, panic twisting their movements. But Emily couldn't bring herself to move. She stood frozen, the beam of her flashlight locked on the creature's eyes that glowed faintly, burning through the darkness with an unnatural intensity. They weren't just watching her. They were piercing into her, as if seeing something she couldn't understand. "Emily!" Jake's voice cut through the trance. He grabbed her arm and pulled her, but the creature's gaze didn't waver. Finally, Emily broke free from the paralyzing fear, and the group scrambled toward the tents. The rustling of branches, snapping of twigs, and that low, rumbling growl followed them, growing closer with every passing second. The creature was moving, and it wasn't making a sound. When they reached the tents, Jake quickly pulled out the small camping axe from his bag, his hands shaking as he gripped it tightly. "What the hell is that thing?" he breathed, his eyes wild. Megan, her face ashen, was clutching her chest as if she were struggling to breathe. "We need to leave. Now. We can't stay here." "We're not going anywhere," Daniel said, his voice filled with determination. He was already setting up a fire starter, trying to reignite the dying embers in the pit. "We need light. We need heat." "Why? What's it going to do?" Emily's voice cracked as she looked between them. She wanted to feel strong, wanted to comfort her friends, but the terror creeping up her spine was too real. "That thing, it's not like anything we've ever seen. What do we do if it comes for us?" Chris, his hands shaking, held up his phone. The flashlight on it barely lit the area around them. "There's no signal," he said, his voice tinged with panic. "We're completely cut off from the outside world." A long, unnatural silence fell over them. The fire pit crackled, and the sound of the forest, distant animals, the wind, the rustling of leaves, seemed to disappear altogether. The silence felt suffocating, and even the air around them grew thick with tension. Then, as if to break the stillness, a voice whispered from the trees. "You should not have come." The words were soft but chilling, carrying on the wind, seeping into the campers' bones. It wasn't the creature speaking. The voice was human, distorted but human. Emily's blood ran cold. She knew it was speaking to them, addressing them specifically, warning them. And as much as she wanted to dismiss it as the wind or her imagination, she couldn't. There was something deeply wrong with the air, with the forest, with everything. The creature didn't move, at least not at first, but its eyes glowed brighter in the dark, reflecting the flickering light from the fire pit. The growl from earlier was replaced by a soft hiss, as though it were laughing, low and guttural, echoing through the woods. "We didn't mean to intrude," Jake called out, his voice shaking but attempting to sound strong. "We didn't know. Please, we'll leave." The laugh grew louder, more mocking. The shadows around them seemed to deepen. "You can't leave now," the voice whispered again, closer this time. "You've already been marked. The land has claimed you." Emily looked at her friends, their faces filled with confusion and fear. The words didn't make sense. They were just campers. They hadn't done anything wrong. But that's when she remembered the old story Megan had told earlier, the Black Hollow Witch and the pact made long ago. Had they unknowingly walked into a place where no one was ever meant to be? Daniel looked around, his eyes scanning the trees. "That voice, it's not just one person. There's something else out there with it. Maybe it's the witch," Megan said in a hushed tone. "Or something worse." Before anyone could respond, a new sound filled the air. Something soft at first, like the rustling of fabric, then louder, like a wind pushing through thick brush. The creature stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was struggling to keep its form intact. It was taller now, almost impossible to comprehend, its limbs elongating with each step. It was growing, expanding, not just in size but in presence. A bone-chilling shriek filled the air, so loud that it made the campers flinch. Emily pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the sound, but it only seemed to grow louder. It was as though the very forest itself was crying out. The figure's body shuddered, and Emily saw something that made her stomach drop. A shadow, crawling from beneath the creature's skin. The shadow twisted and writhed, alive in ways that weren't natural, as if it was a part of the entity, something that could never be separated. "Get in the tent," Jake shouted, his voice frantic. "Go! Now!" The group rushed to their tents, but Emily was last, pausing just long enough to glance back. The creature was right there, just a few feet away, its head tilted at an impossible angle, its eyes fixed on her with a malevolent hunger. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the creature vanished into the woods with a speed that left Emily breathless. The forest went silent again. Emily collapsed into the safety of the tent, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Her friends were already inside, huddled together in fear. She could hear their frantic whispers, but none of them seemed to know what to do. "What was that thing?" Megan whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know," Emily said, her voice shaking. "But it's not over. I don't think it's going to let us leave." They all sat in the dark, the fire's light barely visible through the thin fabric of the tent. Each of them felt it, the terrible weight of the forest, the oppressive silence, and the unsettling knowledge that they were not alone. Suddenly, a thud echoed from outside. It was soft at first, but loud enough to make them all stiffen. Then, a slow, deliberate scratching sound. And then, a whisper, faint but clear, carried on the wind. "I see you." The wind howled through the trees, but it wasn't the kind of wind that felt natural. It was cold, harsh, like it was pushing against the campers, urging them to leave. Emily sat up in her sleeping bag, her eyes darting nervously to the others, but no one dared to speak. The words from the voice in the woods still lingered in her mind. "You've already been marked. The land has claimed you." It didn't make sense. They were just a group of friends camping for the weekend. There was no reason they should be caught in something this horrifying. But the sense of doom was so palpable that it felt like they were suffocating under the weight of it. The scratching sound outside the tent grew louder, then stopped abruptly. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The forest was eerily quiet again, save for the faint rustling of leaves in the distance. "Should we do something?" Megan's voice broke the silence. She was sitting up in her sleeping bag, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. "We can't just sit here," Daniel whispered. "We need to find out what that thing was, and why it's after us." Jake, sitting with his back against the tent wall, clutched the axe he had brought along, his knuckles white. "What if it comes back? What if it knows we're inside?" Emily swallowed hard, trying to steady her racing heart. "We can't just sit here, but we have no idea what's out there." What if it's waiting for us to make the first move? They were all silent for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. No one wanted to go out there, but it felt like doing nothing was just as dangerous. Finally, Chris stood, his face set in grim determination. We need answers. Sitting here and waiting for it to find us isn't going to help. Let's stick together. We go out, find it, and figure out what it wants. Chris, you're crazy, Megan hissed, but there was a hint of fear in her voice. That thing could be anything. You don't know what it is. I know, he said quietly, his gaze locking with hers. But we don't have a choice. Emily's stomach churned, but she knew he was right. They had to face whatever was out there. They couldn't just sit in the dark, hoping the creature would leave them alone. Jake grabbed a flashlight from his bag and handed it to Emily. If we're going out there, we need light. But we can't let it see us coming. Stay close, don't split up. The group nodded, and one by one, they unzipped their tents, stepping out into the cold, oppressive night. The fire had long since gone out, leaving only the weak, trembling light of their flashlights to guide them. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees towering like dark sentinels. Chris led the way, his footsteps slow but deliberate. The rest of them followed, their hearts thumping in their chests. The air was thick with tension, the silence pressing in from every direction. As they moved deeper into the woods, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent her pulse racing. She kept her flashlight low, casting narrow beams of light across the forest floor, but the darkness beyond seemed endless. Where are we going? Megan asked, her voice shaking. Just ahead, Chris replied. We need to get closer to where we saw it. We can't let it keep us in the dark. The woods seemed to stretch on forever, the trees growing denser and the ground becoming uneven with every step. Emily stumbled over a hidden root and caught herself on a nearby tree trunk. I can't take it anymore, Megan whispered, her voice breaking. I can't be in this place. It's wrong. I know, Daniel said quietly, but we have to find out what's going on. We can't leave until we know what's hunting us. As they continued, the forest felt more oppressive with every step, as if it were alive and watching them. Emily's flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the trees. The air was cold, biting, and the sense of being followed was overwhelming. Suddenly, Chris stopped. He held up his hand to signal for silence. The group froze. There, in the distance, at the edge of the clearing, they saw a figure standing perfectly still. It was tall and thin, its form obscured by shadows, but there was no mistaking it. It was the same creature they had seen earlier. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but Emily could feel its presence, like a pressure pressing down on her chest. She could feel its gaze locked on them, piercing through the dark, but it didn't come closer. What does it want? Eric whispered, his voice trembling. Why won't it just leave us alone? I don't think it's going to, Chris said, his voice low and steady. Not until we give it what it wants. The creature stepped forward, its long limbs unnaturally long, its head jerking at impossible angles. The eerie glow from its eyes was enough to freeze them all in place. It tilted its head, staring at them, its mouth opening in a grotesque, silent scream. Run! Jake shouted, breaking the silence. He turned and bolted through the trees, the others following in a panic. The creature moved swiftly, its movements jerky and unnatural. It seemed to glide more than run, its tall form looming over the trees. Emily's heart hammered in her chest as she ran, her flashlight bouncing wildly in her hand. The sound of footsteps pounding behind her made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, and she dared not look over her shoulder. They didn't know where they were going, only that they needed to run, needed to get away. They crashed through the underbrush, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the woods. Then, without warning, the ground seemed to disappear beneath them. Emily's foot caught on something, and before she could react, she was falling. She hit the ground with a hard thud, pain shooting up her leg. She struggled to push herself up, her breath coming in ragged gasps. As she lifted her head, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The clearing they had been running toward was gone. The trees had closed in, and the path they had been following no longer existed. They were surrounded, trapped in a small, barren patch of land. No, Chris breathed. This isn't possible. The creature was now standing at the edge of the clearing, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. Its form was shifting, growing larger, more monstrous. It was no longer just a thing of shadows, it was something real, something ancient. And they were caught in its trap. The ground beneath Emily's feet began to tremble, the earth shifting, like it was alive. The trees creaked and groaned as though the forest itself were moving. The voice from the trees whispered again, louder this time, "The land has claimed you." And then, the creature stepped forward, its mouth opening wide in an awful, inhuman grin. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the creature advanced, its unnatural form casting an elongated shadow across the clearing. The trees surrounding them creaked and moaned as if they were alive, the air thick with the oppressive weight of something ancient and malevolent. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a painful reminder that they were no longer in control of their fate. "Stay together," Chris shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. He reached out to grab Emily's arm, pulling her toward the center of the clearing, where the group had huddled together in fear. The others gathered around him, their faces pale, eyes wide with panic. Jake's grip on his axe tightened as he scanned the dark edges of the forest. But the creature was the only thing visible. Its glowing eyes were locked on them, unwavering and predatory. "We need to do something," Jake said, his voice hoarse. "We can't just stand here and wait for it to come at us. Whatever we do, it has to be quick," Megan added, her voice barely a whisper. She clutched her arms tightly to her chest, as though trying to protect herself from some unseen force. "We don't have much time." The creature moved closer, its long limbs stretching unnaturally. The ground beneath it seemed to bend and warp as it walked, the earth cracking and shifting in its wake. It was like nothing Emily had ever seen, like a shadow made flesh, a nightmare come to life. "Chris," Emily said, her voice shaking. "What do we do? What is that thing?" "I don't know," Chris replied, his eyes scanning the dark forest around them. "But we're not getting out of here unless we figure it out. We need to know what it wants." Suddenly, the creature paused, tilting its head at an impossible angle, its glowing eyes fixed on Emily, and for a moment, everything went still. It wasn't just watching her. It was studying her, analyzing her, as if it could see into her very soul. "I think it's trying to communicate," Daniel said quietly, his voice trembling. "But how do we understand it?" Before anyone could answer, the creature let out a low, rumbling growl. The sound vibrated through the air, making the ground beneath them shudder. Emily felt her blood run cold as the creature began to step forward, its feet making no sound as it moved. Every step was deliberate, calculated, and it was coming closer. Without thinking, Emily took a step back, her feet slipping on the uneven ground. She could feel her breath quicken as the creature's eyes never left her. "Don't move," Chris snapped, his hand outstretched as though to stop her. But Emily was frozen, her legs locked in place by a fear so deep it felt like her body was betraying her. The creature stopped just a few feet away, its glowing eyes locked onto hers. It didn't make a sound, but Emily could feel its presence, could feel the coldness radiating from it as if it were drawing all warmth from the air. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Then, in the silence, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered, its voice echoing in her mind, the words slipping into her thoughts like ice. The voice was not human. It was older, darker, like something that had been trapped in the woods for longer than anyone could remember. Its tone was smooth, coaxing, like a lullaby, but Emily could hear the malice behind it. "We didn't know," Emily managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "We didn't know about you. We just came to camp. We didn't mean any harm." The creature didn't move, but its eyes flickered as if considering her words. Emily's heart raced. She wasn't sure what kind of answer she was expecting, but she knew this wasn't it. The forest around them seemed to shift, and Emily felt the pressure in the air grow heavier. The trees no longer felt like trees. They felt like sentinels watching them, waiting. The creature's lips curled into a grotesque smile. It doesn't matter if you knew or not. The land has claimed you. Your presence here has already sealed your fate. The words sank in, leaving a cold, bitter taste in her mouth. What do you mean? What does it want with us? The creature tilted its head again, the movement too smooth to be natural. The land was promised something long ago, and you have awakened it. You have broken the pact. A shiver ran down Emily's spine as she looked around at her friends. They were all just as confused, just as terrified. But it was clear now that something terrible had been set in motion the moment they had arrived. What pact? Megan's voice was a choked whisper. What are you talking about? You don't understand, the creature said. You can never understand. But it's too late now. The pact is sealed. The woods will never let you go. With that, the creature's form began to blur, its edges melting into the shadows as though it were one with the night itself. Emily's eyes widened as she realized it was fading. Not leaving, but becoming part of the forest. Suddenly, the earth beneath their feet trembled again, more violently this time. The trees shook as if they were alive, their branches creaking and groaning under the strain. The air grew thick with an unnatural energy, and the ground cracked open, revealing dark, swirling tendrils that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. We need to run, Chris urged, his voice tight with fear. Now! Without waiting for another second, the group turned and fled through the woods, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the silence. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps as she ran, the cold wind whipping at her face. But no matter how fast they ran, it felt as though the forest was closing in on them, pressing down on them from all sides. The trees loomed tall, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. And in the distance, Emily could hear something that made her blood run cold. A low, rhythmic thumping, like the heartbeat of the forest itself. Go! Go faster! Jake shouted, his voice hoarse with panic. Emily's legs were burning, but she couldn't stop. They couldn't stop. The woods were alive, and they could feel the presence of something ancient and evil pursuing them, closing in with every step. Then, just as they reached the edge of the clearing, something strange happened. The trees seemed to shift. The path they had been following was gone. They were back where they started, trapped in the same patch of land. What's happening? Megan gasped, her voice shaking. We can't get out, Daniel whispered. We're trapped. We're in the heart of the forest. The creature's voice echoed again, cold and mocking. It's too late. And that's when the forest came alive. The ground shook beneath their feet, the trees groaning with an unnatural force, as if the forest itself were coming to life. Emily's chest tightened with fear. The trees around them seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, and the whispers of the wind no longer felt like the breeze they were familiar with. It was something darker, something alive. Chris grabbed Emily's arm, his face tight with determination. We can't stay here, he said, his voice steady despite the panic in his eyes. We need to find a way out. I don't understand, Megan whispered, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. How are we supposed to get out when the forest won't let us? Emily's heart pounded in her chest, the echo of the creature's words ringing in her ears. The woods will never let you go. We're trapped, Jake said, his voice rough, as he turned in a circle, trying to see any possible way out. We have to figure out why. There's something here, something ancient. Suddenly, the air grew even colder, and the trees around them seemed to bend inward, their branches twisting toward each other, like fingers clawing at the sky. The dark shadows between them grew deeper, more intense, as though something was hiding within. Chris took a step forward, his face grim. We need to stop panicking. We need to figure out what the creature meant about the pact and why it wants us here. Daniel swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously between his friends. How do we even begin to figure that out? It's like the entire forest is against us. Chris turned his attention to the ground beneath their feet, his eyes narrowing. Look at the ground. There's something here. Emily's eyes followed his gaze, and she felt a chill run through her veins as she saw it. The earth beneath them was cracked in places, long dark lines running through it like veins, pulsating faintly with an eerie, unnatural glow. The lines seemed to form symbols, symbols that didn't belong, symbols that seemed familiar, but she couldn't place where from. "What the hell is that?" Megan gasped, stepping back. "Is that some kind of ritual?" Emily's stomach dropped. It looked like a ritual, a terrible, dark ritual. The symbols on the ground were arranged in a circle, each one glowing faintly with the same unnatural light. And at the center of the circle, there was something even more disturbing. A stone altar, cracked and weathered, but clearly ancient. It was covered in moss, but something about it made Emily's skin crawl. It wasn't just the age or the decay, it was the sense of history, a history that felt wrong. Something had happened here. Something terrible. "We need to leave," Jake said, his voice filled with panic. "This place is cursed. It's not safe." Chris shook his head. "No, Jake. This is it. This is what we've been looking for. This is where the creature said the pact began. If we want to get out of here, we need to understand it." Emily felt a wave of nausea wash over her as she moved closer to the stone altar. There was something drawing her in, something pulling her toward it, even though every instinct in her body told her to run. "What happened here?" she whispered, almost to herself. "Come on, Emily," Chris urged. "Stay with us." But Emily couldn't look away from the altar. There was something about it, something calling to her. She stepped closer, her breath shallow, her mind racing. The symbols on the ground seemed to pulse, vibrating as if they were alive, and a feeling of dread washed over her, suffocating her. It was then that she saw it. At the very center of the altar, embedded in the stone, was an object that looked like it had been placed there for some dark purpose. It was a ring, blackened with age, its surface etched with the same symbols that had appeared on the ground. The ring seemed to shimmer in the moonlight, as though it were absorbing the very light around it. "Emily, don't touch it," Chris warned, his voice filled with fear. But it was too late. Before anyone could stop her, Emily's hand was already reaching out. The moment her fingers brushed the ring, the air around her seemed to freeze, and a terrible pressure pressed down on her chest. The ground beneath her feet seemed to give way, and her vision blurred as if the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. She gasped, her hand trembling, her body frozen in place as she felt something cold and dark flood her mind. The ring pulsed with an energy she couldn't describe, something ancient and malignant, and she felt it in her bones, in her soul. A voice echoed in her mind, low and guttural. It was the same voice from the woods, the creature's voice. "You have sealed your fate," it whispered, each word a cold wind against her skin. "You have touched the ring. The pact has been made." "No!" Emily gasped, jerking her hand away. She stumbled back, her heart racing in her chest. The pressure in the air lifted, but the feeling of dread didn't go away. The creature's presence lingered in her mind, dark and unrelenting. She turned to Chris, her voice desperate. "We need to get out of here. Now!" But it was too late. The earth trembled again, this time with a deafening force that sent them all stumbling. The trees began to shake violently, their branches snapping and twisting, as though something deep in the forest had been awakened. And then, the ground beneath them cracked open with a deafening roar, and from the depths of the earth, something rose. A figure emerged from the chasm that had opened in the ground. It was large, towering over them, a shape made of dark shadows and shifting forms. Its eyes burned with the same malevolent glow as the creature in the woods, and its mouth opened in a silent scream, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. "This is the Guardian," Chris whispered, his voice filled with awe and terror. "The one who protects the pact." The Guardian's form shifted, its body twisting and writhing, becoming something more monstrous with every passing second. The ground seemed to bend beneath its weight as it approached them, its steps causing the earth to tremble. "It's coming for us," Jake gasped, his face pale with fear. "What do we do?" "Run," Chris said, his voice tight with panic. "We need to get away. Now!" But as they turned to flee, the trees seemed to move on their own, closing in, blocking the path. The very forest was turning against them, trapping them in the center of the clearing with the guardian looming in front of them. "We're trapped," Daniel shouted, his voice panicked. "There's nowhere to go." Emily's pulse raced as she tried to think. The creature had warned them. The pact had been made the moment she touched the ring. They were in its grasp now, and there was no escape. The guardian stepped closer, its eyes gleaming with a cold, terrible hunger. "You should have left," the voice echoed in their minds again. "Now you will pay the price." And just as the guardian reached out to claim them, the ground beneath their feet erupted, and the world went dark. The darkness engulfed them, thick and suffocating. For a moment, Emily couldn't tell whether her eyes were closed or open. She could feel the ground beneath her, solid and unyielding, but everything around her was pure blackness. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she tried to breathe, but the air felt too thick, as though it was pressing down on her chest. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the darkness lifted. Emily gasped for air, her lungs burning as she sucked in the cool night air. The familiar smell of pine trees and earth was gone. Instead, the air smelled like rot and decay, thick with a heavy, oppressive weight. Her eyes strained against the dim light, trying to make sense of her surroundings. She was no longer in the clearing. They stood on what seemed like a vast expanse of dry earth, the ground cracked and barren beneath their feet. The trees, if they could still be called trees, stood like twisted skeletons, their bark stripped away, leaving gnarled branches that clawed at the sky. There was no moonlight, no stars, just the faint, sickly glow that seemed to pulse from the earth itself. The place was wrong, felt wrong. Where are we?" Megan whispered, her voice trembling as she looked around in horror. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. "This isn't the forest." "I don't know," Emily said, her voice shaky. She took a hesitant step forward, her heart racing. The ground beneath her feet crunched as she moved, each step unsettling, like she was walking on brittle bones. "But we're not in the woods anymore. We've been pulled somewhere else." Chris stepped forward, his expression grim. "This place, it feels like a prison. A place where things are kept locked away." "We need to get out," Jake said urgently, his voice sharp with panic. "We need to get back to the camp before what?" Emily's thoughts raced, but she didn't voice the question. She could already feel it, the oppressive presence that had surrounded them in the woods. It hadn't just been the creature, it was the land itself. They were trapped here, and whatever had brought them here, whatever pact they had disturbed, was still watching. Emily swallowed hard. "Chris is right. We don't know what's going to happen, but we have to keep moving." As they began to walk, the eerie silence around them seemed to press in, growing heavier with every step. The twisted trees loomed like dark sentinels, their blackened limbs reaching out as if to trap them, to pull them back into the shadows. The more they walked, the more disoriented Emily felt. The landscape stretched on endlessly, as if they were walking in circles, trapped in some nightmarish maze. Emily's pulse quickened, the weight of something unseen bearing down on her. It was suffocating. "We need to find out what the pact is," Chris said, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to understand what we've done and how to undo it. There has to be a way." Emily glanced at him. "What if there isn't?" "We have to believe there's a way," Chris insisted, his eyes scanning the bleak landscape. "We have to keep moving, or we'll never escape." Megan shivered beside her. "I don't want to be here. I just want to go back." None of them said anything in response. They all felt it, the overwhelming sense that they weren't alone. The air was thick with a presence, a lurking malice that seemed to be waiting, watching. They had stepped into a world that wasn't their own, a place where the rules of the living didn't apply. The ground beneath them rumbled again, low and distant, like the sound of something far beneath the earth stirring. Emily froze, her heart racing. The rumbling grew louder, closer, as if something was moving beneath them. The ground cracked open in front of them, and a figure slowly emerged, crawling from the darkness, dragging itself from the depths of the earth. It was the guardian, It was larger now, its form more solid and grotesque. The tendrils that had once been its arms were now thick, sinewy limbs, covered in jagged, blackened scars. Its face was no longer just a shadow. It was twisted, a grotesque mask of hunger and rage. Its eyes burned with a malevolent glow, and its mouth opened in a silent scream, revealing rows of sharp, broken teeth. The guardian stepped forward, its enormous form towering over them, casting a shadow that stretched out in all directions. It didn't speak, but its presence was deafening. It was the embodiment of the forest itself, the creature that had been bound to protect the pact. Emily took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. What does it want from us? Chris clenched his fists. It's here to make sure we pay the price for what we've done. We didn't know, Megan cried, her voice breaking. We didn't know about the pact. We didn't mean to disturb anything. The guardian didn't respond. It simply watched them, its eyes narrowing as though considering their words. Then, slowly, it reached up and extended one of its twisted, jagged hands toward them, its fingers curling like claws. Emily's heart slammed against her ribs. It was coming for them. They weren't just trapped in this place, they were being dragged deeper into it, into whatever dark force the pact had unleashed. Chris stepped forward, his face determined. We need to break the pact, he said, his voice steady despite the terror that gripped him. There has to be a way. Emily didn't know if there was, but she had to hope. She had to believe. The guardian took another step forward, its eyes glowing with a dark hunger. Emily's body tensed as it neared, and she knew without a doubt that if they didn't do something, they would be consumed by whatever ancient force the pact had unleashed. I know what you've done, the guardian growled, its voice deep and guttural, reverberating in their bones. And now you will pay the price. It raised its hand high, its claws shimmering in the sickly light. Emily's heart stopped. She knew what was coming. In one swift motion, the guardian swung its arm down toward them, its claws cutting through the air like a blade. But before it could strike, a loud, eerie crack split the air, and the ground beneath them erupted in a wave of energy. The guardian recoiled, its body writhing in pain as the energy surged through the air. The world around them shook violently, and the twisted trees groaned, their roots pulling free from the earth. Emily stumbled backward, her heart racing. What was happening? A figure appeared before them, standing tall and unmoving. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was dressed in dark robes, his face obscured by a hood. But there was something about him that felt wrong, like he didn't belong in the world they knew. The guardian hissed, its form quivering in agitation. You shouldn't be here, it snarled. The man didn't respond. He merely extended his hand toward the creature, his fingers glowing with an otherworldly light. And with that, the ground shook again, and the earth began to swallow the guardian whole. It writhed and screamed, its form dissolving into the blackness, disappearing into the depths from which it had come. The man turned to them, his hooded face still hidden in shadow. You've disturbed something you don't understand, he said, his voice cold and distant. And now you must face the consequences. And before Emily could speak, the ground trembled again, and the world went black. Emily's head throbbed, and her vision blurred as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The ground beneath her felt unsteady, the earth shifting and pulsating like it had a heartbeat of its own. She stumbled, her knees buckling, but before she could fall, a firm hand gripped her arm, pulling her upright. Megan? Emily's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. She looked around, disoriented. The clearing, the dark trees, the twisted figure. They were all gone. Instead, she stood in a place that was worse than a nightmare. The man, the figure who had saved them, or perhaps condemned them, stood nearby, his presence somehow more oppressive than the creature they had just faced. His face remained hidden beneath the hood of his cloak, and the eerie silence around them only deepened the sense that something was terribly wrong. Where are we? Megan's voice trembled. She had her arms wrapped around herself, her face pale as she glanced nervously around. The man finally spoke. You are in the heart of the forest, he said, his voice deep and resonant, as though it reverberated within Emily's chest. The place where the pact was made. Pact? Jake asked, still trying to make sense of their situation. What pact? What are you talking about? The man turned slowly toward them, his hands hidden within the folds of his dark cloak. He regarded them with something that might have been pity, though it was hard to tell through the shadows that veiled his face. The pact that has bound this land, he said. And now you are bound by it as well. Emily felt a chill crawl down her spine as the words sank in. What do you mean? We didn't know. We never meant to. You need to understand, the man interrupted, his voice sharper now. You trespassed in a place where trespassers are not forgiven. The pact was made long ago to keep the forest and its power safe from outsiders. When you entered, you broke the boundaries. And now you will suffer the consequences. Suffer? The word hung in the air like an unspoken curse. Emily glanced at Chris, who looked as shaken as she felt. Jake and Megan stood close together, their faces drawn and pale. What happens now? Chris asked, his voice steady despite the fear that tightened his chest. The man's lips curled into a grim smile. The forest demands a price that will not be paid easily. Emily's heart raced, her breath shallow. What kind of price? He stepped closer, his cloak swishing with an unsettling rustle. The air grew colder with his approach, and a sense of dread pressed in on her from all sides. You will face the consequences of your intrusion. The forest will take what it is owed. What you value most. There was a pause, a suffocating silence, as Emily's mind raced. What did they value most? What could the forest take that would hurt them? The answer was clear. It wasn't just their lives that were at risk. It was everything they held dear. Your lives are not enough, the man continued, his voice a low growl now. But don't worry, the forest is patient. It will wait. He took a step back, his presence becoming even more foreboding. What do we have to do to stop it? Megan asked, her voice desperate. The man hesitated before answering, his head tilting slightly as if considering. There is no simple solution, he said. You cannot undo what has been done. All you can do now is try to survive. Until the forest decides you've paid enough. With those words, the man turned and began to walk away, his footsteps eerily silent despite the dry earth beneath them. Emily felt her stomach twist as the realization settled in. They weren't just in danger, they were in a prison of the mind and spirit, where they had no control over their fate. We need to leave, Jake said urgently, his voice tight. We need to find a way out of this. We can't leave, Emily whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. We're trapped. But before they could react, the ground beneath them trembled again, stronger this time. Emily's heart skipped a beat as the trees surrounding them seemed to shudder in response, their twisted branches creaking and groaning like the sound of bones breaking. Something was coming. From the shadows, a figure emerged, a dark silhouette against the faint light, moving impossibly fast. Before Emily could even blink, the figure was upon them, a monstrous presence that seemed to stretch and grow with every heartbeat. It was the Watcher, the creature they had encountered before. But now it was different. Its eyes gleamed with a cold, malicious fire, and its mouth, a jagged rift in its face, opened in a terrifying roar that sent a shockwave through the air. The forest itself seemed to respond to the creature's call, its roots shifting and writhing like serpents as if coming alive, eager to claim what had been offered. Run! Chris shouted, his voice raw with fear. But before they could move, the ground split open beneath their feet. It was as if the very earth itself had been waiting for them to make a mistake. From the chasm, dozens of long, spindly arms reached up, grabbing at their ankles and wrists. Screams filled the air as the group struggled to break free, but the more they fought, the tighter the grip of the earth seemed to become. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she felt herself being pulled downward, her body sinking into the black abyss. She could hear the others screaming, but their voices sounded far away, as if distorted by the chasm between them. No, she thought, this couldn't be the end. Help us! She screamed, her voice raw with terror. Please! The Watcher loomed overhead, its eyes glowing brighter now, as if feeding off their fear. It opened its mouth, but instead of sound, a dark, guttural hiss poured forth. A voice not of this world. "You will all become part of the forest," it whispered, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "And when you are forgotten, I will watch." And then, the ground closed in around them and everything went black. Emily's eyes flickered open, and the first thing she noticed was the oppressive stillness. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and a heavy silence hung around her like a suffocating fog. She was lying on the ground, her body aching as if she had been dragged across sharp stones. Her hands shot out, pressing against the cold, wet earth beneath her. She tried to sit up, but her limbs felt like lead. Panic surged in her chest, and she gasped, forcing her eyes to focus. She was no longer in the chasm. The ground had not swallowed her whole. She was in the woods, but it wasn't the same woods. The trees were different, twisted, gnarled, with bark that seemed to ripple like the surface of a dark pool of water. Their branches stretched far above her, blotting out what little light had broken through the thick canopy. The air felt heavier, as though the very atmosphere was infused with dread. "Emily?" It was Megan's voice, and it was faint, as if coming from a great distance. Emily's heart skipped a beat, and she struggled to her feet, ignoring the pain that lanced through her muscles. "Megan!" Emily called out, her voice shaky but desperate. "Where are you?" A rustling sound came from behind a cluster of twisted trees. Emily turned toward it, her breath catching in her throat. She could see Megan's silhouette through the dense fog that seemed to roll in from nowhere, and her heart filled with a mix of relief and fear. "Megan, we need to get out of here," Emily shouted, taking a step toward her. But as Emily moved, the trees seemed to shift. They weren't just blocking her path, they were closing in. The space between them began to narrow, and soon, she found herself surrounded. The oppressive feeling of being watched crawled along her skin like invisible fingers. She felt a sudden, sharp tug on her sleeve. Spinning around, Emily found herself face to face with Megan, who looked just as disoriented and terrified as she was. "I don't understand," Megan whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "How did we get here? Where are we?" Emily didn't know how to answer. The woods were alien, the trees towering over them like silent sentinels. But worse than that was the deep, gut-wrenching sense that something ancient, was watching them. "We have to stick together," Emily said, trying to steady her trembling hands. She didn't even know if she believed her own words, but she knew they had no choice. The forest was alive, and it wasn't friendly. From somewhere deep in the woods, there was a low, almost imperceptible sound, a rustling, as if something enormous was moving just beyond their sight. The sound of limbs snapping echoed through the trees, too close for comfort. "Did you hear that?" Megan asked, her voice barely a whisper. Before Emily could respond, the earth beneath their feet began to tremble again, and the ground split open in front of them. This time, there were no arms reaching out from the abyss, just a gaping hole, black as pitch. "Go!" Emily cried, grabbing Megan's hand and pulling her away from the chasm. They ran, their footsteps echoing in the silence that seemed to press in around them. They could hear the distant sound of something chasing them, but they dared not look back. They rounded a corner in the woods and stumbled into a small clearing. For a moment, they thought they had escaped, but then Emily froze, her blood running cold. In the center of the clearing stood a figure, hooded and cloaked, as tall as the trees around them. The figure was motionless, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. "You cannot escape," it said in a voice that wasn't human, low and guttural, like the growl of a wild animal. Emily's throat tightened, but she forced herself to speak. "Who are you?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it reached up and lowered its hood, revealing a face that was not a face at all. Just a void, a black emptiness where eyes should have been, where a mouth should have been. "We are the Watchers," the figure said, its voice sending chills down her spine. "We were here before the forest. We are the forest. And you—" It paused, its voice turning cold and menacing. You have disturbed what should never be disturbed. Megan stepped back, her face pale as death. What do you want from us? The watcher tilted its head, the darkness of its face seeming to grow deeper. You have already given what you owed. The price of your survival is yet to be paid. Emily's stomach lurched. What price? The price of intrusion, the watcher whispered. You sought answers, and now the forest has taken what it needs. The ground beneath their feet shifted again, and the trees seemed to close in even tighter, like a noose tightening around their necks. Emily could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Run, the watcher hissed, its voice suddenly laced with malice. Run as fast as you can. But it won't matter. You can never outrun what's coming. Before Emily could react, the ground beneath her cracked open once more. She barely managed to hold on to Megan as they were dragged toward the chasm, their bodies sliding toward the darkness. She reached out, trying to grab hold of anything, but the earth kept pulling them in, faster and faster. And then, everything went black. Emily's eyes snapped open, but the world around her was still dark. The air was thick, damp, and smelled of decay. Her body ached, and she struggled to sit up, her hands shaking as she pressed them against the cold, wet ground. Her heart was still pounding from the terror that had gripped her moments before, and her mind raced to comprehend what had just happened. She looked around, her eyes slowly adjusting to the darkness. Megan was beside her, still unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. Emily could feel the weight of the earth beneath her, a suffocating weight that seemed to hold them in place, as though the forest itself was preventing them from moving. The sound of whispers filled the air, low, unintelligible voices that seemed to come from every direction. It wasn't just the trees that were alive. It was the very ground beneath them, the soil, the wind, the shadows. Everything felt like it was waiting for them to make a move, waiting for them to make a mistake. Wake up, Emily whispered, shaking Megan's shoulder. We need to get out of here. Megan stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked confused, disoriented. And then, as the memories flooded back to her, her expression hardened with fear. We're still here, she said, her voice shaking. I thought it was over. I thought we escaped. Emily stood up, her legs unsteady beneath her. She helped Megan to her feet, and they both surveyed the scene. The trees were even darker now, their gnarled branches twisted into unnatural shapes. The shadows seemed to move of their own accord, slithering like living creatures. We can't leave, Emily whispered. The forest won't let us. Megan glanced around, her eyes wide with terror. Then what do? We find a way to break the pact, Emily said, though she wasn't sure how they could do that. The watcher's words still echoed in her mind. The price of your survival is yet to be paid. She didn't understand what that meant, but it seemed like the only way forward was to face whatever the forest demanded. As they began to move through the woods, the silence grew heavier. The air seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, and the path ahead was unclear. They stumbled through the underbrush, trying to navigate the maze of twisted trees and thorns that seemed to close in around them with every step. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder. The trees began to shift, their branches creaking and groaning as if they were stretching toward the sky, reaching for something, reaching for them. Stop, Emily said, her voice low but firm. We need to listen. The whispering was growing louder, almost deafening. It was as though the forest itself was speaking to them, whispers that carried messages of warning, of dread, of the ancient pact that bound them to this place. And then, as if by some unseen command, the forest fell silent. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the trees seemed to part, opening into a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood the watcher, its form darker and more terrifying than before. Its eyes glowed faintly, casting an eerie light across the clearing. You have come, it said, its voice a guttural growl that sent chills down Emily's spine. And now you will pay the price. Emily's heart raced, her breath coming in shallow gasps. What price? What do you want from us? The watcher's eyes narrowed, its gaze fixing on them with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The forest demands balance, it said, its voice cold and dispassionate. A price must be paid for your intrusion. Your lives are no longer enough. It is not just your lives the forest seeks. It is your very essence. The ground beneath their feet cracked open, and Emily felt herself being pulled toward the center of the clearing. Her body felt heavy, as though the earth itself was trying to consume her. She reached for Megan's hand, but the darkness was closing in around them, faster and faster. "You can't escape," the Watcher said, its voice now rising in a maddened crescendo. "The forest is ancient. Its hunger is eternal." In that moment, Emily realized the truth. They weren't just being punished, they were being consumed. The forest wasn't just alive. It was a force of nature, an entity with its own will, its own desire to take and destroy. As the darkness enveloped them, Emily felt herself slip into the void, her body pulled into the ground, her mind overwhelmed by the weight of the forest's hunger. And then, just as she thought all was lost, she heard a voice that seemed to come from nowhere, a voice that rang out with a strange, otherworldly clarity. "Not yet." The darkness paused. The ground stopped pulling her in. It was a voice of power, of defiance. And for the first time since entering the woods, Emily felt something stir within her. A spark of hope. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with uncertainty. A figure appeared in the shadows. A man, no, a spirit, clad in tattered robes, his face hidden beneath a hood. He stood tall and powerful, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "I am the guardian," the figure said. "I was once part of the forest, but I broke the pact, and now I can help you break it too." The figure stood motionless in the center of the clearing, its presence like a bolt of lightning, cutting through the suffocating darkness. Emily's heart raced in her chest, her pulse echoing in her ears. Her mind whirled, desperate to understand who or what this figure was. The Watcher, the creature that had been tormenting them, paused, as if confused by the sudden appearance of the new figure. The trees around them seemed to hold their breath, the very air alive with tension. "You dare to interfere?" The Watcher's voice was a low, mocking growl, the earth trembling slightly as it spoke. The figure in the shadows raised one arm, a gesture that seemed to ripple through the very fabric of the woods. The Watcher's malevolent presence faltered for a brief moment, its dark eyes flickering with a hint of uncertainty. "I do not dare," the hooded figure replied, his voice booming, carrying an undeniable weight of authority. "I am the one who was betrayed, and now, I seek to free those who are trapped in this cursed land." Emily and Megan stood frozen, watching as the scene unfolded before them, unsure whether to run or stay. The earth seemed to groan underfoot, as if the land itself was aware of the challenge being presented. "Who are you?" Emily finally managed to whisper, her voice shaking but resolute. The figure turned toward her, its features still obscured by the hood. Yet something about his presence felt comforting, familiar, as though he held the key to their salvation. "I was once like you," the figure answered, his voice softening for a brief moment. "A traveler, lost and seeking answers. But I found more than I bargained for. I became a part of the forest, a prisoner to its ancient pact." The Watcher hissed, its form shifting in the shadows. "You speak of betrayal, guardian, but you are a traitor to the pact. You have no power here." The guardian's eyes blazed with defiance. "The pact is a lie. It's an illusion of power, born of fear. It has controlled the forest for centuries, but it can be broken." Emily felt her breath catch in her throat as the weight of his words sank in. A lie? Could it be true? Could they actually escape the forest? Breaking the pact, the guardian continued, his voice firm, requires sacrifice. A price must still be paid, but not in blood or flesh. The forest feeds on fear, on despair. It thrives on the darkness in our hearts. But if you can stand against it, if you can show no fear, no submission, you will take back your freedom. Megan's voice was barely a whisper. "What do we need to do?" The guardian's gaze turned to the Watcher, his expression darkening. "We need to confront it. Together." The Watcher howled in fury, its form swelling like a storm about to burst. Its eyes blazed with fury as it loomed above them. "You cannot escape me. The pact will never be broken." But the guardian stepped forward, raising his hand to silence the beast. "You are nothing but an illusion. You feed on our terror, but we will show you no fear." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. The guardian's words rang with truth, but the terror in her mind was hard to silence. Yet, looking at Megan, at the fear in her friend's eyes, she knew what they had to do. They had no choice. Emily and Megan took each other's hands. The woods felt alive with tension, the shadows pressing in on them from all sides. The watcher snarled, its form shifting into something monstrous, something that seemed to grow larger with every passing second. But the two girls stood tall, their bodies trembling, but their resolve unshaken. "Do not be afraid," the guardian said, his voice resonating with power. "You are not alone." Emily squeezed Megan's hand, and for the first time since entering the forest, she felt the fear recede. It was still there, lurking in the corners of her mind, but it no longer had control over her. The watcher had no power over her. She would not let it. With a defiant breath, Emily turned toward the watcher, her voice steady. "We will not be your prisoners. We are free." And in that moment, something changed. The watcher let out an ear-splitting screech, its form cracking and splitting like brittle wood. The ground trembled beneath their feet, the trees shaking as if in agony. A brilliant light erupted from the guardian's outstretched hand, engulfing the watcher in an otherworldly glow. "No!" the watcher howled, its shape melting into the light. "You cannot!" The clearing exploded with a blinding flash. When the light faded, everything was still. The oppressive weight of the forest lifted, and for the first time, Emily could breathe freely. The woods were silent, too silent. "Megan," Emily whispered, turning to her friend. Megan's face was pale, but there was no fear in her eyes. She looked around in disbelief, as if she had just woken from a nightmare. "We're free," Megan said softly. Emily nodded, her heart still racing from the intensity of the moment. They had done it. They had broken the pact. But the forest was not done with them yet. The guardian stood beside them, his form now more solid, his presence powerful and commanding. "The forest will heal now," he said, his voice full of sorrow. "But the price of your freedom, it is not without consequences." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" The guardian's face softened, a trace of sadness in his eyes. "The forest will always remember those who dared to break the pact, and it will call on you again. One day the price will be paid, again." The ground beneath their feet began to shift, the forest growing quieter, the trees seeming to recede into the distance. Emily and Megan exchanged a nervous glance, unsure of what the future held. But for now they were free. "We will be ready," Emily said, her voice steady, though she knew the price might one day come due. As they stepped away from the clearing, the trees parted, and the path ahead seemed to beckon them. The watcher was gone, but the shadows of the woods would always linger, haunting their steps. The forest had been defeated, for now.